We will now move to our first speaker, Dr. Alix Gould-Worth. A quick intro for her. She is the Chief Evaluation Officer for the United States Department of Labor. Prior to her time at the Department of Labor, Dr. Gould-Werth worked at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, Mathematica, and Fountain House. Dr. Gould-Werth is a nationally recognized expert on unemployment insurance, paid family and medical leave, schedule stability, and other issues affecting low-wage workers and their families. You can see why we invited Dr. Gould-Werth to speak to you today. Her topic is low pay and more, challenges facing today's low-wage workers. Dr. Gould-Werth, please, you have the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I'm just gonna share my screen. All right, can you see everything that you should be able to see and hear me? All right, wonderful. I will get started. Okay, so yes, I am Alix Gould-Worth. I am the Chief Evaluation Officer at the U.S. Department of Labor, and it is my true pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'm going to talk with you about what we know about low-wage work in the United States. Let's get started. All right, so for today's talk, I'm kind of, I think I'm betraying the fact that I was a history major in undergrad, and so I'm going to be kind of talking through with you a perspective through time. We're going to start with a historical view, so talking about how low-wage work has evolved over the past 60 years in the United States. Then we'll get into the view from today. Who are these low-wage workers? What are their jobs like, and where we go next. And because I am trained as a researcher, I'm going to pay some special attention to the role of research in this work. All right. So let's get going. The historical view. How has low-wage work in the United States evolved? All right, so this chart is a busy chart, but do not worry. We're gonna go over it together. What this chart is showing is the polarization of earnings over the past 60 years represented in 2023 dollars. So all these data points take into account inflation, and you can kind of think about, if I'm saying $5,000, it's what you think of as $5,000 about today, right? And you see that there are 5 lines on your screen. And what those lines do is they take the entire workforce and they look at their earnings and they say, okay, the people who are earning the lowest 20%, what's their average wages? The people earning the highest 20%, that's the light blue triangles at the top, what are their average wages? And then what are the average wages of the quintiles in between? So you can see here that from 1963 to 2023, there was an increase in earnings for workers at the very bottom of the earnings distribution, moving from about $5,000 to $14,000. And that can reflect the kind of growth and productivity in our economy. But the highest upward trend, right, is among workers in the top 20%, right? In 1963, they were taking home about $76,000 on average. Today, they're taking about $130,000 home on average. But when we look at this top 20%, right, there's different experiences even within that group. So I want to quickly show you the top 5% of earners, right? So pulling those out, you're seeing that their earnings are really skyrocketing. So all the growth and increases in efficiency and productivity and just producing more as an economy, that's really accruing to the top 5% the most. So in 1963, they were at around $116,000. Today, they're around $250,000. That's more than doubling. In comparison, if you look at the bottom 80% of workers, you're looking at a much more flat trend. So I think it's important to note that over these 60 years, just as we've seen a polarization in income that's coming in from work, so we have seen a polarization in job quality, with people who are kind of at the bottom of that distribution also having fewer benefits, worse working conditions, less control over their work and their time, and comparatively more better benefits, more control, safer and healthier working conditions conditions for folks at the top of the income distribution, although a lot of scholarly work has also focused on the pressures that folks at the top are also facing. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to be focusing on folks in that bottom 20% or the bottom 40%, but I think an important thing to keep in our minds is this polarization that's in the backdrop, with some workers experiencing really different conditions than folks at the bottom. All right, so we just kind of went over the earnings distribution over time, but I want to also unpack another economic dynamic that has unfolded parallel to the polarization of job quality, which is our increasingly service-based economy. So looking at this chart here, you can see that since the 1960s, spending on services, that's the blue line on top, has outpaced spending on goods, which is the green, the purple, I know my colors, the purple line at the bottom. So spending on services could be healthcare, it could also be fast food or getting your nails done, and spending on goods, it could be groceries, it could be a car, it could be a couch. And as you can see, going back through the 60s, our economy, people have always been spending more on services than goods, but there's been a divergence with a real increase in service spending. You'll see during the COVID pandemic, right, there was a dip in spending in both categories, with a larger dip in the service spending, but that now we're kind of picking up on the same trajectory we left off. Okay, so what's the theme here? Spending on services increasing faster than spending on goods. So you might not be surprised then to see that while employment, right, turning to the people who are making those services and goods, employment in the goods producing sector has remained flat, yet employment in the service providing sector has really skyrocketed. And, similarly, there was this dip during the COVID pandemic, but we're kind of back on the same track, right? Our employment is increasingly in the service providing sector. Okay, so right, we've gone over kind of the bifurcation of income and the polarization of the workforce, and then we've talked about the service sector. So those two facts are going to kind of come together as we talk about the view from today: who are low-wage workers? All right, so let's take a look at the median earnings distribution in the United States by occupation, and these are figures from 2023. So you can see that looking at these broad occupational categories, that managerial and professional occupations are the highest compensated, taking home a median, like an average earnings of $70,000 annually. Then kind of the highly skilled production and craftspeople are following that at $47,000, then technical, sales, and administrative. But if you look to kind of the bottom of this chart, you'll see that the lowest compensated workers in our economy are people who are in the service occupations, taking home an average of $25,000 a year, right? So we see that service work previously is increasingly becoming the backbone of our economy, yet service workers are receiving low compensation. Okay, so before I go on to the next slide, I'm going to give you a petite tutorial on occupational categories and industry. This could be a much longer, more complex talk, and I dare to say it might be even a little more dry and boring than the talk I'm giving now, or maybe really fascinating if you love it, which I do. But okay, so what is an occupational category? An occupational category is describing the type of work someone does. So like a lawyer might fall into the managerial and professional group, but a chemist might fall into that kind of technical group. And then you might have janitorial staff or people providing food that are falling into that service category, right? Members of a single occupation can work in different industries, right? So we might have some service workers working in retail, others working in hospitality, janitorial staff working in an office building, so there's a wide range of industries even within a given occupation. So that kind of leads to a question: what industries are people in the service occupation working in? And if you look at this chart, you should be able to see, looking at kind of the 40% and forward line, the bulk of service sector workers are working in industries that pay below average wages, right? So we see big chunks of service workers in leisure and hospitality, in retail, in transportation, and warehousing, right? So they're occupations that pay low wages clustered in industries that pay low wages. Okay. So we kind of now know a bit about who low-wage workers are, right? They're kind of disproportionately workers in the service sector, and this is an incredibly important component of today's economy and labor market. Who are these service sector workers? What are their demographic groups? Now, so I have 4 pie charts kind of looking at their service of their demographic characteristics, right? So the first one is age, right? And you can see here that service workers are diverse in age. And there's this stereotype that, you know, service workers are young people who are getting pocket money just to spend. But in reality, you know, it's true that 26% of, or 27% of service workers are under age 25, but we see, you know, a fifth of them 26 to 35, another fifth of them 36 to 45, another fifth 55 and older. And even in that younger category, these are people with real lives and real responsibilities. So they're using their income from work to pay for childcare and food and rent. These are people with real responsibilities. Then if we move over to the sex pie chart, looking at kind of the breakdown between men and women in the service sector, you'll see that the service sector, women disproportionately are service sector workers. So 60% is, you know, greater than half the population, and it's also greater than the percentage of women in the workforce. So women are 47% of the workforce, but 60% of service workers. Looking to the race chart, you'll like the first thing that pops out to me is this big purple chunk where you see that a lot of service sector workers are white, 70%. And that kind of reflects the demographic composition of our country and our workforce. But white workers are actually underrepresented in the service sector, 77% of the workforce, but only 71% of the service sector, which means members of marginalized racial groups are overrepresented, right? So if you pick a service sector member out of a hat, they are more likely to be a person of color than would be the case in the general population. And finally, if we turn to the Hispanicity pie chart, you'll see that about a quarter, or over a quarter, 27% of service sector workers identify as Hispanic or Latino, and that is much higher than the proportion in the workforce, right, where Hispanic or Latino workers are less than 20%. So kind of looking across all 4 pie charts, we see that service sector workers are really diverse in age. They're across all stages of the life course, and that they're more likely than the folks in the general population to be members of marginalized demographic groups. Okay, so now we know kind of who these service sector workers are. Let's think about what it looks like to be a service sector worker. What is your job like? Okay, so I'm showing you here all workers, all civilian workers, regardless of sector, and their access to employer-provided benefits. So you can see that, you know, it probably doesn't come as a surprise to you that while we have a society that's structured so that people rely on these on receiving benefits to their employer, such as health insurance, retirement benefits, not all employers provide them. So we're looking at like 75 to 80% of employers providing these benefits across the general population. If we zoom in though, to add in these orange bars, which are service workers. You'll see that they're much less likely than the general population of workers to receive these benefits, right? So only half receiving retirement or medical benefits through their employer. Around 60% receiving paid sick leave and vacation. So that's a really low accessibility of benefits that are very important and an important part of how we think about job quality in the United States. People talk a lot about benefits as part of job quality. A part of job quality that I think isn't talked enough about is scheduling and the kinds of schedules that you work. So working a predictable schedule that you have control over is really important to your quality of life, right? If I know when I'm going to be working, that means that I probably know how much money that I'm going to take home, and I probably know when I'm available for things and when I'm not. So it means it's easier for me to get to the doctor, to arrange for childcare, maybe to take a class, all the things, to plan a social life. All of those things are contingent on me understanding my work schedule. And so this chart represents a kind of narrower slice of service workers. We're looking here at food and retail workers at large employers in the United States. But within this group, we can see that they really have unpredictable and low quality schedules. So over 60% are experiencing last minute shift changes, having less than 2 weeks notice typically of their schedules. And then in addition to not having notice, which hours kind of on the clock you work matters for the quality of your schedule. So a clopening shift, right, is one where you close down the store. So maybe you work at a coffee shop, you close it at 10 p.m. or like closes at 9, you're done with closing at 10, you head home, maybe because you're a low-wage worker, you live pretty far from where you work, so it might be a long commute, but then you're expected back at the shop to open the next day, maybe at 5 a.m., leaving very little time for sleep or anything else you might want to do between your 2 shifts. And over half of workers in this group are having at least one opening shift, right? So that's a real issue with work quality. Okay, so we see that service workers are struggling with volatile and unpredictable hours. And then they're also struggling with difficult conditions at work that include harassment and here even interpersonal violence, right? So there are a lot of different health and safety at work is another important dimension of job quality. Okay, so that's where we are. That's where kind of the state of being a low-wage service sector worker in the United States. Where are we going next? And of special interest to me is what is the role of research? Okay, so I'm going to talk about 2 different things that research can do. The first one is diagnosing the problem. Okay, so all the other slides that I've shown you have been full of data. All of that data is analyzed and collected through the process of research, right? So it paints a picture for us, and it's telling us that today we're finding ourselves in a polarized labor market where some jobs are providing high wages, good benefits, supporting working conditions, and others are providing meager wages, few or no benefits, and grueling working conditions. The service sector jobs that are forming the backbone of our economy are typically these bad jobs, and they're disproportionately worked by members of marginalized groups. So, right, we've described this polarization that's part of diagnosing the process, but then the next thing that comes up is the question of why. Why have we seen this polarization over the last 60 years? There's a really healthy academic debate about this topic. So some scholars are arguing that some workers simply don't have the skills they need to get jobs in today's economy. So this picture is, I am a person who doesn't really have the skills to get like a tech job in today's economy. This picture represents what I imagine the inside of a computer to look like. Might be really outdated. But the idea is, right, that our economy is increasingly based on technology, and we need workers to have tech skills in order to get good jobs. Other scholars focus on these buzzwords of deregulation in the fissured workplace, I know that that's kind of what you've been talking about yesterday from the helpful summary that Dr. Rubin provided. And I know that later today, you're going to hear from David Weil, who's the real expert on these topics. But as a teaser and as a summary, I'll kind of remind you that over the past 60 years, the same time we've seen this polarization and this servicization, I just made that up, of our economy, our workplace structures have also changed, right? So we're seeing more workers employed by franchises through subcontracting and temporary work arrangements, classified as independent contractors, right? And our labor laws and regulations simply, which is another thing I think you talked about yesterday, have simply not kept up to ensure that today's workplace is safe, receives the wages to which they're entitled, and can access protections from FMLA to disability accommodations to paid sick leave, right? So there's one group of scholars that are focusing on this fissured workplace. And then finally, some scholars are focusing on worker voice. So you can see here that over the same time period, like 1965 to present, that the economy has become service-based and earnings polarized. Union density has fallen in the private sector. So, it was at a high in the post-war years. And then today, it's lower than it was in the 1920s when we're looking at the private sector only. Different story with public sector workers. Okay, so those are some things that researchers are doing to try and diagnose the problem. And then research has another role, which is trying to point towards solutions. Okay, so if we go back to think about the computer chip example, that workers aren't getting the wages they need because they don't have the skills they need, employment and training programs exist to address this concern by simply, it's not so simple, but by training workers for better jobs. And we can see that the most effective worker training interventions are boosting wages by about $1,000 annually. That is not chopped liver. If you think back to those very early slides that I was showing you about the wage distribution in the bottom 20%, people earning $15,000 annually, $1,000 is a lot. And then at the same time, there are researchers looking at the development and enforcement of workplace regulations, which are really aiming to, they're thinking about that cracked earth slide I showed you, aiming to combat deregulation in a way that takes into account the fissured workplace. And so, one study shows that looking at workers that earn about $17,000 annually, employers simply not following existing laws about paying wages cost workers $2,600 a year, right? Again, not small potatoes. Another study saying that when a jurisdiction passes a law that requires employers to provide paid sick leave to their workers, earnings increase by about $2,300 annually. Again, not small potatoes. So here, right, with the bullets on the side, these are really under-researched areas. These are 2 small bullet points, and there's a lot of room to learn more. And then finally, right, okay, so on the last slide, I was focusing on how can we determine what works and take a really technocratic approach to change. One thing that I forgot to mention, I think going back to this slide, right, I talked about the technological change, the fissuring of the workplace. The other thing is worker voice. And my plan is to kind of leave the discussion about worker voice to the true experts on this topic, right? They're going to be speaking the next panel, so stay tuned. But then what else can kind of research do when it comes to providing voice or just shining a light on issues? So this slide is from the editorial board of the New York Times published this. If you squint really close, you can see it was on March 14th, 2020. So right at the outset of the COVID pandemic. This is data from Kristen Harknett and Danny Schneider that you'll hear from later today. And they're just showing you the number of workers at different employers that don't have access to paid sick leave. More than 500,000 workers at McDonald's, more than 300,000 at Walmart. So you can really picture that and you can think about what is happening, and that can kind of spark public policy change or activism, right? So this is another really important role of research. All right, so that is it for me. I think the key takeaway is that low-wage work, we live in a polarized society of a polarized labor market, and research is one tool that we can use to kind of address that. I'll stop sharing.